My name is Linda Pierce, yet I am commonly referred to as Lindy. I am 58 years old and have been in this little town in Ohio my entire life. While some individuals depart, I remained. I was raised here, employed here, and now I merely reside here. I never anticipated narrating my tale in this manner. Yet here I stand, an ordinary lady leading an unremarkable existence. I am employed at the neighborhood gas station convenience store. Nothing ostentatious. I process snack transactions, brew coffee, and converse with patrons regarding the weather or current local events. I have been engaged in this activity for more than 30 years. It lacks excitement, although it fulfills my financial obligations, which is all I anticipated. My days merge consecutively, and I frequently contemplate the life I envisioned for myself. However, I do not express dissatisfaction. I was not raised in abundance, hence I have adapted to managing with few resources. The issue was never financial. I have consistently been the kind of somebody that endeavors to excel, attends to others, and maintains a low profile. Perhaps that is the reason I find myself in this situation. I seldom contemplated my future. I contemplated retirement, possibly engaging in travel and adopting a more leisurely lifestyle. However, I am anticipating events prematurely. I have lived many years, and at times I contemplate that it was merely a preparation for this moment. However, there is one factor that transformed my entire existence. My kid, Benjamin. He was once everything to me. I single-handedly reared Ben. Ben's father abandoned him during his youth, and I exerted much effort to ensure he lacked for nothing. I sacrificed extensively for him, including my time, aspirations, and all else. I would up around 5:30 each morning, prepare him breakfast, assist with his academic tasks, and ensure he had the necessary provisions. Although it was challenging, it proved to be worthwhile. He constituted my raison d'être. I adored him profoundly, believing that sufficed. Upon Ben's departure for college, I anticipated that it would mark the commencement of my life anew. I anticipated having time for myself. However, as soon as I contemplated retiring, Ben returned home following a tumultuous breakup. I did not waver for an instant. I opened the door, greeted him upon his return, and contemplated. This is my purpose. I would assist him in regaining his stability. I could still fulfill the maternal role he required. However, everything transformed with his encounter with Michelle. I recall the day he presented her to me as if it were yesterday. She exhibited vivacity and exuberance, while Ben appeared more content than I had observed him in several months. They exhibited charm as a couple, and I endeavored to provide assistance. However, there was an aspect of his discourse on her. It was distinct. It seemed as though he had progressed beyond our relationship, leaving me uncertain about my emotions toward the situation. He began allocating more time to Michelle and diminishing his time with me. He would accompany her, leaving me at home in solitude, and I increasingly became aware of it. The distance between us increased, and I was unable to identify the cause. I may have been overly suspicious, but it seemed as though I was losing him. Recently, he nonchalantly informed me, "Mom, Michelle and I have been discussing, and we believe it is time for me to cohabit with her. We will search for a location." I remained immobilized, however I concealed the extent of my pain from him. I grinned and remarked, "That's excellent, Ben." However, internally, I sensed a gradual dissolution of my presence, as though he no longer required my existence. That evening, I occupied the kitchen table, gazing at the vacant chair opposite me, and I acknowledged a truth I had long been too apprehensive to confront. My son was no longer my progeny. He had progressed, while I remained present. The days following Ben's revelation regarding Michelle felt peculiar, as if the atmosphere in the home had become denser. I continued to set the table for two, despite the evident fact that I am the sole diner. I reassured myself that this was merely a phase of his transition, although the quiet between us intensified, palpable with each step I took across the home. He was present, yet absent. He would return home, yet he was perpetually engaged with his phone, consistently texting or conversing with her. I was reluctant to acknowledge it, yet it caused me pain. One morning, I prepared pancakes, his preferred dish, and arranged the table as I routinely did during his presence at home. I waited, as I often did, anticipating his emergence from his chamber, when we would converse aimlessly, reminiscent of our past interactions. However, hours elapsed, and the pancakes became cold. I examined my phone. No communications. No telephone communications. It was as though he had forgotten the essence of being a son. I heard the front door open at approximately noon. Ben entered. His cheeks somewhat reddened from the cold. Although he did not regard me as he always did, he no longer smiles as he once did. "Hello, Mother," he stated, his tone devoid of emotion, as if addressing an unfamiliar individual. I stood there, clutching a plate of pancakes, and for a moment, I felt as though I did not belong in my own kitchen. "Greetings, Ben," I remarked, attempting to conceal the void in my tone. "I am a great favorite." He did not even glance at the pancakes. He retrieved a bottle of water from the refrigerator and had a lengthy sip. "I am convening with Michelle and many acquaintances in the coffee shop." He stated he will return later, his tone indicating distraction. Subsequently, without uttering another word, he seized his jacket and departed. I remained stationary, the plate in my grasp, gazing at the vacant chair opposite me. It felt akin to a visceral blow to the abdomen. I was uncertain about my emotions. Was I expected to feel joy for him? Are you proud? Was this the essence of motherhood, forfeiting all merely to witness your child deteriorate gradually? I was unaware, yet I felt ineffectual, as though a portion of my essence was being obliterated. The subsequent days adhered to the same trend. Ben would return home late, and I would be asleep by the time he arrived. I would awaken to the sound of him preparing to depart in the morning. Yet I would receive neither a greeting nor an embrace. I would endeavor to be unaffected by it. He had reached adulthood. He possessed an independent existence. However, the solitude further burdened me with each passing day. Subsequently, one evening, it transpired. Ben returned home accompanied by Michelle. She wore a smile, as if she were doing me a favor by her presence. They entered, interlinked, joking at a topic I did not overhear. I remained in the corridor, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. Michelle glanced at me, her smile wavering, as if uncertain of my acceptance of her presence. "Hello, Mrs. Pierce?" she remarked, the civility in her tone nearly contrived. I offered a strained smile, attempting to conceal the pain her words inflicted. "Greetings, Michelle. How are matters progressing?" I inquired, attempting to maintain civility. "Excellent," she responded, casting a glance at Ben. "We were contemplating a drive later. Ben indicated that you were amenable to us borrowing the car. I became immobilized, Request to borrow the vehicle. They did not inquire at all. I was aware that Ben's car was consistently available for his use. However, he did not even take the initiative to inquire with me. His mother, if it was permissible. I experienced a profound sense of despair. Ben appeared oblivious. He was preoccupied with removing his coat while conversing with Michelle regarding their plans for later. I observed him, this individual who once relied on me, now positioned before me as a stranger. His focus was directed towards her, his new family, the family from which I was no longer included. I will be upstairs if you require assistance, I stated, my voice scarcely audible. I then turned and proceeded to my room, allowing them to continue in my absence. I perched on the side of my bed, my hands quivering. How could this transpire? At one point, I was the focal point of Ben's existence. And now, at that moment, I was merely an individual he scarcely recognized. I could not recall the last occasion he expressed his love for me. I experienced the burden of years of sacrifice, the meals I had prepared, the prolonged nights spent in concern for him, all of it crashing upon me like a tidal wave. I gazed at the picture frame on my dresser, depicting Ben and me during a family vacation in his youth. We were laughing, with his head resting on my shoulder. He appeared exceedingly joyful and naive. However, that was in the past. This is the present, and in the present, I am unnecessary. The morning following Ben and Michelle's departure, I found myself gazing at the identical table I had arranged for years. The chairs, the dishes, everything remained in its customary position. However, the house seemed altered, devoid of life. I was fatigued, depleted in a manner that I could not articulate. Perhaps it was the insomnia induced by pondering Ben's whereabouts, or the pervasive silence that enveloped the house. Or perhaps it was simply the burden of acknowledging that I had irrevocably lost him. I endeavored to re-establish my routine, attend work, procure coffee from the diner, and tally the minutes until I could return home and immerse myself in silence. However, nothing seemed appropriate. The enthusiasm had dissipated. I could not recall the last occasion I engaged in an activity for my own benefit. I felt as though I were a specter in my own existence. One evening, Ben returned home unexpectedly. The door opened, revealing him, weary yet resolute. He initially spoke little, merely uttering, "Hey, Mom," as he placed his bag on the floor. An unsettling premonition lingered in my mind. You are aware of that moment when you sense the ground shifting beneath you, yet you are powerless to act. I experienced that sensation. "Mother, I have been contemplating," Ben said, his tone notably grave. I became immobilized. I anticipated that this dialogue would be challenging. He possessed that expression, the one indicating he had something significant to convey, and I anticipated I would not appreciate it. "What is it, Ben?" I inquired, attempting to maintain a steady tone, although I could already sense the worry ascending my spine. He seated himself at the kitchen table, his hands arranged neatly before him. "Michelle and I have been conversing regarding the house," he stated. "We have concluded that it is time for you to, indeed, downsize." I paused, uncertain whether I had heard him correctly. "Downsize?" I inquired, my voice almost above a whisper. It felt as though the air had been extracted from the room. What do you mean by downsize? Ben exhaled audibly. It is simply too large for you. Mother, you do not require this extensive room. You are aging, and I prefer you not to reside here alone. We believe it would be more advantageous for you to relocate to a smaller space. Initially, I was unable to comprehend his statement. Are you requesting that I sell the house? My voice faltered, and I promptly cleared my throat, attempting to maintain composure. He nodded, avoiding my gaze. Indeed, I believe that is the optimal choice. I yearned to scream, to convey that I was unprepared to relinquish all that I had established here, all that had constituted my life for an extended period. However, the words lodged in my throat. I remained silent for what seemed like an eternity, merely gazing at my son, attempting to comprehend the transformation of the man I once recognized. Ben, this house means everything to me. It's not merely a space, it constitutes my life. I stated, my hands quivering. I nurtured you in this environment. This is the location where we have created numerous memories. How can you unilaterally make this decision for me? Ben glanced up at me, and for an instant, I perceived an emotion in his eyes, perhaps regret or guilt. However, it was ephemeral. I understand it is difficult, Mother, but this is truly the most advantageous course of action. For both of us, you must consider your future, and Michelle and I are progressing. We cannot continue to postpone this. In that moment, I was left with nothing but the empty resonance of his words. He was not acting for my benefit. He was acting for his own. He sought to avoid the burden of a mother who depended on him. He aspired to construct his own existence with Michelle, a life from which I was no longer necessary. I gazed at him, my heart shattering in a manner that felt tangible. Is that all? I inquired, my voice trembling. Are you merely going to sell the house? No dialogue, no regard for my emotions. I'm doing this for your benefit, Mother. He stated, his tone now detached, quite mechanical. It's time for you to progress. I abruptly rose, unable to remain seated any longer. I do not require to move on. Ben, I asserted, my voice gaining strength with each word. I have resided here my entire life. I have sacrificed everything for you, and now you are discarding me as if I am inconsequential. Ben averted his gaze, massaging the nape of his neck. I am not discarding you, Mother. This is for the best. You will see. I shook my head. No, Ben, you fail to comprehend. I am not prepared to relinquish this. I am not prepared to be discarded as if I am a burden. With that, he departed, leaving me in a silence that appeared to have intensified. The words he uttered reverberated in my mind. It's time for you to go on. The gravity of the situation struck me with overwhelming force. He had departed. He had already progressed, while I remained here attempting to ascertain my identity in his absence. The home was not merely comprised of bricks and walls. It was the place where I had invested my heart in nurturing him, where I had devoted every ounce of love and every moment of my life. And now, just like that, it held no significance for him. I sank into the chair. My hands gripped the table. I had sacrificed extensively for him, yet he had progressed without a moment's hesitation. The subsequent days felt as though I were traversing through mist, with everything progressing in slow motion. Ben's words reverberated in my mind, resonating like a bell I could not mute. It is for your own benefit, Mother. That phrase echoed often, each iteration inflicting deeper wounds. I endeavored to maintain a facade, attended to my professional duties, tidied the home, engaged in trivial conversations with patrons, anything to prevent my thoughts from descending into chaos. However, nothing seemed appropriate. The silence within the house was overwhelming. The vacant chair at the kitchen table, the unconsumed pancakes I had prepared merely days prior, the incessant hum of the refrigerator that appeared more pronounced than ever, all served as a persistent reminder of my profound solitude. I ceased arranging the table for two. It felt inappropriate, as though I was clinging to a fragment of my life that had ceased to exist. I was uncertain about my purpose. The prospect of downsizing and relocating to a small apartment repulsed me. I could not simply relinquish all that I had established here, all that I had devoted to Ben. However, there was an additional concern, something that troubled me. I began to observe minor details. His belongings were absent. Gradually, he began removing his possessions, the guitar he had played, his old textbooks, the clothing he wore in his youth. All of it was vanishing. He was gradually removing himself from life. I believed we still had a connection. It was not until I ascended to the attic to retrieve some antiquated Christmas decorations that I observed it. His journal. It had been concealed in a box beneath some old garments. I am uncertain as to why I retrieved it. Perhaps it was merely the desire to discover something, anything, that could elucidate my mistakes. Alternatively, I might have simply want to retain a fragment of the sun I believed I understood. I opened it, my hands quaking as I turned the pages. The recognizable handwriting, the boy I had nurtured, the one who once confided in me, now focused solely on Michelle. His thoughts, dreams, and frustrations were all interwoven with her name. However, I then observed a small passage inscribed in hastily applied ink, as if he feared someone might read it. I believe I can no longer continue with this. Mother has become overwhelming. I cannot continue attempting to balance her and Michelle. I acknowledge her efforts, but she fails to comprehend. She is overwhelming me. I must liberate myself. I gazed at the text. They struck me with the force of a blow to the abdomen. I had been stifling him. I devoted my entire life to ensuring he had all his necessities, yet it seemingly was insufficient. I was no longer merely a mother to him. I was a burden. Tears flowed rapidly and intensely. I was momentarily unable to breathe. He portrayed me as a burden, a weight he was compelled to bear. The son for whom I had sacrificed everything, my time, my love, my devotion, now perceived me as an obstacle. I desired to scream and hurl the journal across the room. Yet I remained seated, clutching it to my chest, allowing the gravity of his words to permeate my consciousness. I experienced failure. I exerted considerable effort, yet ultimately, I proved insufficient for him. I was inadequate for anyone. The most distressing realization was that the house, the one place I believed I could cling to, was no longer mine. It belonged to him. It has always belonged to him. Upon his decision to abandon me for Michelle, I felt as though I had lost everything. This house represented more than mere shelter. It embodied all my love, heart, and effort. However, to Ben, it was merely an item for sale, something to dispose of. I set the journal aside and ran my hands over my face, attempting to erase the tears. I had nurtured him to be self-sufficient, to lead his own life, yet I never anticipated that it would result in the forfeiture of my own. I was uncertain of my identity. I felt the burden of my emotions overwhelming me, yet I refused to succumb. I had demonstrated resilience for an extended period to allow this to dismantle me. I had sacrificed everything for him. However, it was now time to contemplate my own desires. I would no longer be the victim. I refused to remain passive and allow him to dominate me. I had a life to pursue, regardless of his desire to disengage from it. The more I contemplated it, the angrier I grew. No one has the authority to diminish my worth, not even my son. I am uncertain about the motivation behind my actions, but one morning, following a notably restless night, I resolved to undertake something for my own benefit. I had devoted numerous years to postponing my life, attempting to maintain stability for Ben, for the household, for everyone except myself. I had abandoned aspirations of travel and a life uniquely my own. However, upon observing the vacant rooms and the silent house, I came to a realization. It was time to cease waiting. I was at work, as on any other day, when I observed something unusual. A flyer was affixed to the bulletin board near the coffee machine, something I had never encountered before. It was a local charity raffle, providing a monetary reward for the victor. The prize was modest, yet it ignited a spark within me. I could utilize that money. It was not fundamentally about the sum. It pertained to the prospect of asserting control over my life, albeit in a minor capacity. I recalled affirming to myself, "Why not?" Consequently, I completed the form, purchased a ticket, and placed it in my pocket, scarcely contemplating it further. It was merely a minor diversion from the turmoil in my mind. However, a week later, they contacted us. I achieved victory. A modest sum. Certainly. It was the first genuine endeavor I had undertaken for myself in a considerable time. For a fleeting moment, it resembled a breath of fresh air, a respite from the oppressive, stifling silence in which I had been existing. I could achieve something with this. Perhaps not significantly, but I could ultimately take action. I did not inform Ben. In fact, I had not communicated with him since our discussion regarding downsizing. He had ceased all communication, and I was not inclined to pursue him. I was finished. If he wishes to exclude me from his life, so be it. However, I was not inclined to remain passive, awaiting his acknowledgement of the profound pain he had inflicted upon me. I resolved to utilize this victory for my own benefit. With the funds acquired from the raffle, I determined to take a long overdue initiative. I contacted a local real estate agent merely to inquire. I informed myself that I was not prepared to sell the house, not at this moment, but perhaps I could begin exploring apartments. I considered smaller locations, perhaps a modest cottage adjacent to the park. I required little, merely a shift in environment. The initial apartment I viewed was a diminutive studio on the outskirts of town. Although it was modest, it belonged to me. A location where I could exhale, no longer traversing that expansive residence in solitude, encircled by recollections of a life I no longer acknowledged. The prospect of abandoning it caused my chest to constrict, yet it simultaneously imparted a sense of liberation I had not experienced in years. Perhaps that is what I required, something modest and tranquil, solely for myself. I made a deposit that afternoon. That night, I traversed the home, engaging with various objects. The antiquated wooden chair in the kitchen, where I once conversed with Ben about academia and existence. The dilapidated couch in the living room where we had viewed films together. These memories were all dissipating. However, I resolved not to allow them to exert control over me any longer. They did not determine my identity. I was more than merely Ben's mother, more than the woman who sacrificed everything for him. I resolved at that moment that it was time to relinquish my hold. I refused to allow my life to be dictated by the decisions of others any longer. Ben had progressed. He had established his life, and I wanted to rediscover my own. I needed to recall my identity beyond the roles I had inhabited for an extended period. The following day, I commenced packing. Not for the apartment, not yet, but for myself. I stored away all the antiquated items, photographs, mementos, anything that connected me to a past I was prepared to transcend. I discarded items that were unnecessary. I did not wish to retain memories that no longer benefited me. I recognized that I was not merely organizing a residence. I was dismantling a life that I no longer wished to inhabit. I had been existing for the sake of others for an extended period. It was time to prioritize my own existence. The decision was finalized. I had already executed the documents for the modest studio apartment, a space that increasingly felt like my own. For the first time in an extended period, I sensed that I was genuinely undertaking something for my own benefit. However, there remained an element within me, something I had been suppressing for years, that was gradually beginning to emerge. I spent the subsequent days clearing the house, packing all the belongings Ben had abandoned. It felt surreal to empty the rooms of his possessions, all the items he had previously taken for granted. It transcended mere physical space. It was about reclaiming my existence. I had sacrificed extensively, but now I needed to regain something. The procedure was arduous. It was taxing, both physically and emotionally. Each box I packed evoked memories I was unaware I still possessed. The day Ben experienced his inaugural soccer match marked his first infatuation and subsequent heartbreak. All those once significant moments now seemed like distant echoes. However, this time, I refrained from crying. I was unable to. I had already wept excessively. I had squandered excessive time in anticipation, awaiting something that would never materialize. I needed to create my own existence, one in which I was not solely identified as Ben's mother, nor defined by the demands of others. I began to engage in activities for my own benefit, pursuits I had neglected for years. I visited the park, seated myself by the lake, and listened to the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. I engaged in lengthy morning walks, experiencing the sun's warmth on my face, a sensation I had not permitted myself to relish in years. It felt as though I was emerging from a prolonged slumber, finally recalling the essence of living for my own sake. I visited the local thrift store and acquired several items for the apartment, nothing lavish, merely some throw pillows, a few bookshelves, and a new coffee maker. Although it was modest, it belonged to me. I was creating something from the ground up, something I could claim as my own, It was a gratifying experience. One day, I resolved to cease my visits to the gas station where I had been employed for an extended period. I had not informed anyone of my departure, and truthfully, I was uncertain about what I would articulate upon encountering the familiar faces. However, I needed to conclude that chapter of my life to relinquish the routine that had confined me for an extended period. Upon entering the store, everything felt altered. The familiar scents and the same dilapidated shelves were present. However, there was an element lacking. I was absent. I was no longer merely the woman behind the counter. I had transformed into an individual with a future that extended beyond the confines of the counter, beyond the monotonous days of processing transactions and existing in obscurity. Kathy, the manager, glanced up from the cash register upon my entrance. "Lindy, welcome back. I believed you were on leave." I nodded, a faint smile playing on my lips. "Indeed, I have concluded my time here," I stated, the words flowing more effortlessly than anticipated. "I have secured a new residence. I am moving on." She gazed at me, momentarily blinking as she processed the statement. "Are you suggesting a complete departure?" "Indeed, for good." I acknowledged with a nod. "For good." She responded with a gentle, almost perceptive smile. "I wish you the best, Lindy." "You deserve it." I expressed my gratitude and departed, my heart racing, but positively. I was liberated, no longer lingering in the shadows, anticipating an event that would not transpire. As I exited the store, I sensed a transformation within me. I was not merely resigning from a position. I was departing from a life that had constrained me for an extended period. Furthermore, I was not simply distancing myself from Ben. I was relinquishing the notion of being confined to the role I had inhabited for so long. I was determined not to remain solely a mother any longer. I was determined to be myself. The apartment was beginning to resemble a home, despite its lingering newness and unfamiliarity. The walls were devoid of decoration, the furniture minimal, yet it belonged to me. I had devoted the preceding weeks to acclimatization, establishing new routines, engaging in lengthy walks, and endeavoring to attain tranquility in my own solitude. I was rediscovering how to appreciate my own life once more, even in minor aspects. For the first time in years, I was not operating on empty. However, the doorbell rang. I was not anticipating any visitors, nor was I certain I desired any. Yet, upon peering through the peephole, I beheld him. Ben. His visage appeared altered, aged in some manner, yet his eyes, those identical eyes that before gazed at me with confidence and affection, remained unchanged. For an instant, I became immobilized. I was uncertain about the emotions I was expected to experience. A mixture of anger, sadness, and relief, perhaps. However, what I experienced predominantly was confusion. I had progressed. I was beginning to construct a new foundation for myself. And now, he had returned, appearing as if he had not just shattered me into countless fragments. I opened the door. His gaze softened upon seeing me, yet there was an unexpected nervousness in his posture. He moved on his feet, appearing uncertain whether to embrace me or flee. "Hey, Mom," he began, his voice wavering. "Can we converse?" I walked away, remaining silent first. I was uncertain about what to convey to him. The words were lodged in my throat. I gestured for him to enter, uncertain of the reception he anticipated. Ben sat on the couch, shifting awkwardly as I sat opposite him. We gazed at each other for a time, the stillness extending between us. I couldn't help but observe how different he appeared. Perhaps it was his demeanor, exuding uncertainty regarding his own choices. Alternatively, it could have been the manner in which his hands fidgeted, suggesting an inability to grasp the present moment. Ultimately, he articulated his thoughts. "I apologize, Mother," he stated, his voice barely audible. "I acknowledge that I have caused you pain. I have disrupted our situation, and I am uncertain how to rectify it." I could sense my heart beginning to race. This was not the Ben I recognized. This was not the son who had taken me for granted, the one who scarcely acknowledged my presence when he was at home. This was extraordinary. I exhaled deeply. "You have caused me more pain than I can articulate, Ben. You do not get the extent of it. You exited my life without a moment's consideration. You disregarded me for someone who was oblivious to your significance in my life. I did not intend to cause you pain," Ben stated, his gaze now fixed on my unwavering. However, I was perplexed. I felt disoriented. Michelle instilled in me a sense of finally regaining control over my life. I believed I was acting correctly. I could perceive the guilt in his tone, but it proved insufficient. It was insufficient to reverse the actions that had occurred. I did not require his apology. I needed him to genuinely comprehend the consequences of his actions. I required him to comprehend that the mother he had abandoned was no longer the same woman. I rose, pacing the room. "Do you believe that merely apologizing will rectify everything? Do you think you can return here and erase the memory of how you discarded me as if I were insignificant?" Ben also rose to his feet, his hands extended, almost imploring. "I do not anticipate your forgiveness, Mother. I understand it will require time, but I am making an effort. I truly am." I turned to confront him, my heart beating. "Time? Do you believe you have sufficient time to rectify all issues?" "I do not require your assistance in rectifying my issues, Ben. I have commenced the process of self-improvement, and you are not permitted to re-enter my life only because your situation with Michelle has faltered." A prolonged silence ensued as he gazed at me, his expression contorted in a blend of remorse and bewilderment. "Is this how it ends? You are simply going to exclude me in this manner, after all I have done?" I shook my head, my chest constricting. "No, Ben, I am not excluding you. I am excluding the version of you that only approached me when it was convenient. I am finished being a secondary option for someone. I am no longer your safety net." He first did not answer. He merely stood there, his visage ashen, his hands dangling at his sides. I perceived the pain in his eyes, and perhaps I discerned a glimmer of comprehension. However, I was not prepared to allow him to return, not at this moment. "You cannot re-enter this space and act as if nothing transpired," I stated gently, my tone unwavering. "I am progressing, and if you wish to re-enter my life, you must earn that opportunity. However, you need to comprehend one thing. My existence no longer centers on you." Ben glanced at the floor momentarily before returning his gaze to me. "I understand, Mom." "I do. I wish I could retract everything. I remained stationary, maintaining his gaze. I am aware of your intentions, although it is not permissible. All we can do now is progress. With that, he turned and proceeded for the door, his shoulders drooping. I observed his departure, remaining stationary as the sound of the door closing reverberated in the silent house. For the first time in months, I experienced a wave of relief. I ceased waiting. I was not anticipating his return to rectify matters. I was not awaiting his acknowledgement of my value. I had ultimately come to the realization that I was of greater value than the remnants he abandoned. The subsequent days were indistinct. Ben's visit remained in my thoughts, yet I did not ruminate on it extensively. I had invested sufficient time anticipating a change, hoping he would ultimately comprehend the extent of his hurtful actions. However, I now recognized that relying on another to rectify the situation was not the solution. It was my responsibility to reconstruct and regain control of my life. For the first time in an extended period, I experienced a surge of excitement. I had concluded my existence in the past. I had ceased to cling to a life that had been stripped from me. However, just as I believed I was progressing, life presented me with another unexpected challenge. I was at the grocery store, acquiring several items for the week. I had established a routine of purchasing food solely for myself, no longer acquiring additional items for Ben or contemplating his preferences. I was selecting what I enjoyed, and it was exhilarating. While waiting in line at the checkout, I unexpectedly encountered someone. Michelle? She stood a mere few feet away, examining the fruit on the display. She had not yet recognized my presence, yet I found myself unable to avert my gaze from her. I had not encountered her in weeks, and during our last conversation, she had exhibited politeness, yet maintained a certain distance. An indefinable quality about her consistently instilled a sense of unease in me, as though there were unspoken truths and unseen facets. However, in that instant, I experienced a fleeting sensation of an alternative emotion. Perhaps it was her seeming ease and confidence, as if she possessed complete control. Alternatively, it might have been the palpable absence of Ben lingering between us like a specter. I was reluctant to create a disturbance or confront her in a crowded store. However, I was unable to restrain myself. I took hold of my cart and approached her slowly, uncertain of what to articulate. However, upon noticing me, she straightened her posture, and the smile adorning her face failed to reach her eyes. "Linda," she remarked in an overly nice tone, "I did not anticipate encountering you here." I compelled a smile, endeavoring to maintain a neutral tone. "Michelle, it's been a while," she acknowledged, peering over her shoulder to ascertain if anyone was observing. "Indeed, it appears that time has passed." A momentary silence ensued before she continued, her tone becoming gentler. "How have you been?" The inquiry appeared excessively contrived, overly practiced. I recognized that her inquiry about my well-being was merely a formality. However, I did not respond immediately. I observed her, noting her posture as if she possessed all the solutions to existence. "I have been well," I finally stated, my voice unwavering. "I am merely acclimating to the circumstances, as you may understand." "Progressing," she acknowledged, yet I discerned a glimmer of something elusive in her gaze, an indefinable quality. "That's positive. Ben has expressed considerable concern for your well-being. He is deeply remorseful regarding the manner in which events transpired." I nearly chuckled. "Are you concerned about me?" Ben was unconcerned about my well-being, He did not contemplate his decision to depart. However, I refrained from expressing my thoughts. "I am confident he does," I remarked with composure. "Ben must now resolve matters independently. He is an adult. Michelle, he has his own life to lead." She shifted uneasily, averting my gaze momentarily. "I am aware. I am aware. However, it can be challenging to maintain equilibrium. Ben is not the most agreeable individual to manage, and I believe he has been experiencing considerable stress. I believe he requires your assistance." The statement affected me more profoundly than anticipated. Ben requires my help. The same Ben who abandoned me for Michelle. The one who disregarded me without hesitation. I had once been his entire universe, and now I was merely another element for him to manage. However, rather than revealing my pain to her, I inhaled deeply and smiled. "Well, Michelle, I believe we are both aware of Ben's requirements. He has made his decision, and I will no longer implore for a position in his life." She stared at me, evidently surprised by my reply. I did not wait for her to respond further. I pivoted and proceeded to the checkout, my heart racing. I was uncertain what compelled me to confront her. But as I exited the store, I sensed a transformation within me. I no longer felt fear. I was not concerned about losing Ben or competing for his affection. I had fought sufficiently. As I entered my car and drove back to my apartment, I came to a realization. Michelle, despite her allure, was not the individual who had assumed control of my life. Neither was it Ben. It was I. And it was the most profound sensation I had ever had. It is amusing how swiftly life can transform when one ceases to await the return of someone to rectify matters and relinquishes attachment to things that were never intended to endure. For the first time in an extended period, I felt as though I was not stagnant. I was progressing, but not merely in a linear fashion. I was advancing towards something novel, something I could claim as my own. The days subsequent to my discussion with Michelle felt more buoyant. The burden I had borne for months, perhaps years, began to dissipate like an unnecessary heavy coat. I was no longer clinging to the persona of Ben's mother, the one who had relinquished everything for a son who failed to recognize her value. I had concluded my involvement with that role. I dedicated the subsequent days exclusively to self-reflection. I adorned the walls of my new apartment with hues of my preference, rather than those that Ben would have selected or that evoked memories of the home in which I raised him. I dedicated extensive evenings to reading, an activity I had not engaged in for years. I strolled by the lake once more, inhaling the fresh air without concern for those I was departing from. However, despite my acceptance of newfound freedom, a subdued anger lingered beneath the surface. I was not simply going to move on from Ben and Michelle. I had invested too many years being disregarded, undervalued, and discarded. I refused to allow them to forget my existence. I was not going to allow them to believe that they could simply depart without repercussions. It was imperative to demonstrate that I was more than a convenient resource, more than the mother who had sacrificed everything only to be cast aside when it was advantageous. I possessed one asset they had not anticipated: my newfound wealth, which I intended to leverage to convey a message. I contacted a lawyer, not for a lawsuit or anything significant. No, this was personal. I had remained silent for an excessive duration. It was now imperative for them to comprehend that I was not an individual to be overlooked. I anticipated that Ben would attempt to contest my position. I was aware he would seek to persuade me that my stance was irrational and that I was merely clinging to the past. However, the reality was that he no longer had the authority to determine the course of my life. That responsibility was mine. The attorney was circumspect, and we ensured that all matters were addressed with discretion. It was not a matter of revenge, as one might presume. There was no theatrical confrontation or altercation. Rather, it was an alternative, more gratifying resolution. I sold the house. The residence Ben believed he could acquire without hesitation. I did not merely sell it. I ensured the transaction was conducted in a manner that would advantage me, providing a safeguard for my future, a life I could construct independently of them. However, that was not the entirety of it. I utilized the surplus funds, which were not essential for my livelihood, but would significantly impact my life. I invested them in a venture I had always aspired to pursue: a small business. A cafe, specifically a quaint coffee shop by the lake, where individuals would gather to unwind, read, and converse, precisely as I had envisioned for myself all those years prior. It was exclusively for me. It was not intended for Ben. It was not for Michelle. It was mine. It was intended for him. As I submitted the documentation for the cafe, a wave of satisfaction enveloped me, not due to having triumphed over others, but because I had commenced living for my own sake. A few weeks later, Ben made contact once more. He dispatched a message, straightforward and unambiguous. "Mother, I wish to converse. I have been contemplating everything, and I apologize. I did not intend to cause you harm. It was not unexpected, not truly. I anticipated his return. He would endeavor to reconcile, attempting to rectify matters in the manner he believed would restore equilibrium. However, I was no longer that individual. I had already progressed." I did not reply to his mail. I had no necessity to. I had already conveyed all that was necessary through my actions and the life I was constructing. I was not going to revert to being the individual who awaited someone else's transformation. No longer. I stood at the counter of my new cafe, sipping my coffee as the initial customers entered. It was tranquil and serene, and for the first time in an extended period, I felt entirely at ease. Ben and Michelle remained in my life, although they no longer exerted authority over it. This was an unfamiliar sensation for me. I was no longer merely an alternative option for someone. I was beyond that. For the first time, I recognized that I possessed the authority to shape my own life. I had spent the majority of my existence allowing others to determine what was best for me. Initially, it was my parents, followed by Ben, and to some extent, Michelle. I consistently believed I was acting correctly by prioritizing others' needs and sacrificing my own aspirations for the sake of those I cherished. However, at some point, I lost awareness of my true self. As I stood behind the counter of my new cafe, observing the sun setting over the lake, I came to a realization. I had not merely relocated from my previous residence or begun a new enterprise. I had undergone a profound transformation, uniquely my own. This was not solely about independence. It was about reclaiming my existence. I had devoted numerous years to treading carefully, ensuring the happiness of those around me. However, no one ever instructed me on how to attain personal happiness. At that moment, I was acquiring knowledge, Each cup of coffee I prepared and every customer who entered served as a testament to my accomplishments. I had produced something that belonged to me. I believe I could not have achieved this without the impetus provided by Ben. I doubt I would have reached this point had I not experienced profound pain inflicted by those I cherished most. Perhaps that was the catalyst I required. A revelation to awaken me, to demonstrate that I am more than merely a caregiver, more than just a mother or an employee. When I initially launched the cafe, I was uncertain about what to anticipate. I was unsure whether patrons would arrive or linger. However, it became evident that they did. People appreciated the inviting ambiance, the artisanal pastries, and the serene location by the water. Regular patrons began visiting each morning, and the establishment gradually evolved into a tangible entity. Consequently, I no longer felt isolated. It felt as though the universe was finally providing me with indications that I was on the correct trajectory. One day, approximately a month after I inaugurated the cafe, a sobbing individual passed by. He first did not perceive my presence. He was with Michelle, his arm encircling her waist as they ambled down the street. He appeared content in a manner I had not previously observed. I observed that he was grasping her hand in the identical manner he once held mine. I experienced no anger. I felt no compulsion to yell at him or to confront him. I merely observed him and came to a realization. I was fine. I would no longer await his apology. I would no longer cling to the perception of him that I had constructed in my mind for an extended period. I had already absolved him, not due to his merit, but because I required release. I would no longer cling to the anguish, the wrath, or the treachery. It was no longer about him. It pertained to me. Ben and Michelle did not visit the cafe that day, but I was indifferent. I had no need to encounter them or validate anything to them. I entered the rear of the cafe, where the shelves were filled with journals, and seated myself at the modest desk I had arranged for my use. I retrieved a new notebook and commenced writing. I have always aspired to compose narratives, recollections, or any thoughts that arise. However, I previously lacked the time. Now I have. I documented my life, my relationship with Ben, the sentiments I wished to express, and the burdens I was ultimately prepared to relinquish. And then I wrote about the future, a future that was no longer delineated by anyone else. It was now mine. I completed my cup of coffee and gazed out the window. The sun had descended, and the sky was transitioning to a gentle hue of purple that I cherished. The cafe was now tranquil, and I could discern the subtle sound of water lapping against the shore. For the first time in years, I experienced a sense of tranquility. I did not require Ben's apology. I did not require Michelle's validation. I did not require anyone to affirm my sufficiency. I had ultimately come to a realization I was sufficient.